Hello, my name is Garima and this is part 2 of my brain dissection video. So before dissecting the brain, I'm just going to analyze and discuss some of the external structures. So for example, this is the left hemisphere, and the left side of this represents the left side of the brain, and it's basically responsible for controlling the right side of the body. Because it's contralateral. It also performs tasks that have to do with logic, such as science and math, as well as language and speech, and it's often called the dominant hemisphere. This is the right hemisphere, which is responsible for more of the creative, imaginative, and intuitive cognitive functions, such as the processing of visual shapes and patterns, as well as attention, emotions, verbal ambiguity, and some applied meanings. And it often controls the left side of the body because this is also contralateral in its functions. This is the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is basically a column of nerve fibers which is responsible for sending and receiving messages from the brain. It runs through the spinal canal, which we can't see here, but it has a lot of branching nerves that branch in the brain, and it influences the rest of the body. It controls movement and organ functions, and it has 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which all have different functions, and they're divided into different categories. This is the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is responsible for maintaining balance and movement. It sends signals for the body to adjust and move appropriately. It also coordinates movement with different muscle groups and times the muscle actions appropriately so that the body can move smoothly. The cerebellum also helps coordinate a lot of eye movements. And finally, it's involved in some of the motor learning because the cerebellum actually helps the body learn movements that require practice and fine-tuning. So for example, when you're learning to ride a bicycle or play a musical instrument, the cerebellum plays an important role in muscle memory for this. So the innermost layer of the meninges is the pia mater, and it's this very thin layer right here that just coats the brain, and it serves as a protective layer, one of the 3 protective layers, which is the innermost one is the pia. And it's a protective layer which prevents the blood and other substances, unwanted substances, from getting in contact with the brain tissue. Then we have our 4 cortexes. The cerebral cortex is basically the outermost layer of the brain, and it has 4 parts. So this part is your frontal lobe, and then you have your parietal lobe here, and then you have your occipital lobe back here, and your temporal lobes here and here. And there's 4 of the lobes parts on each hemisphere, so a total of 8. So the frontal lobe has functions in voluntary movement, in expressive language, and managing higher level of executive functions like the ability to organize, plan, self-monitor, and it contains the primary motor cortex. Your parietal lobe has functions in sensation and perception, so integrating your sensory input within the visual system, and it has the primary somatosensatory cortex. Then you have your occipital lobe back here, and its main function is primarily vision. So for example, processing things like distance, depth perception, and color determination. And then we have our temporal lobes on either side, which are associated with processing auditory sensations and information, and plays a role in processing emotions, language, and as well as visual perception. So down the middle here, we have our medial longitudinal fissure. So I'm just gonna dissect the pia mater right here real quick. And this is the largest fissure of the brain, and it separates the 2 hemispheres from each other. So this flat part, or the top of the valleys of the brain, these ridges are known as the gyrus, and they're basically ridges on the cerebral cortex that serve to increase the surface area of the brain so that more information can be processed and stored. Then we have our sulcus, which are basically the valleys, if you take the hilltops to be the gyrus, and the central sulcus, which I believe is this one here, is what separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Then we have our olfactory bulb right here, I believe, and that is basically what receives the neural input about odors that are detected by cells in the nasal cavity. The axons of olfactory receptors, which are basically the smell receptors, these extend directly into the olfactory bulb where the information about odors is processed. So the nerves would have been coming in from the eyes, meeting at the optic chiasm, and then you have the tracts that go out of the optic chiasm, because now you're in the central nervous system, which is the brain. The optic chiasm, there's basically fibers from the nasal half of the visual field that cross or decussate to the opposite hemisphere in the brain, but where there's information coming from the temporal side of the visual field, the fibers or the information doesn't decussate, and it goes to the same hemisphere that it originally came from. Dissect the brain sagittally across the mid-sagittal plane, and I'm going to go through in between both of the hemispheres, and then also the cerebellum, and then back through the spinal cord, so I can identify all of the internal structures. White veins that are part of the cerebellum, these are called the arbor vitae, which are also known as the tree of life, because they function in bringing sensory and motor information to and from the cerebellum. So this is the thalamus, and the thalamus basically relays sensory impulses from all the sensory receptors except for olfaction. A sensory impulse basically travels down from the body surface toward the thalamus, which then receives a sensation, and it relays this to the particular part of the cerebral cortex for interpretation of, for example, touch, pain, or temperature, or one of the other sensations. Right below the thalamus is your hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus basically releases hormones and regulates body temperature, maintains physiological cycles. It controls your appetite, it manages sexual behavior, it regulates emotional responses, and it also modulates your endocrine system because it has connections with the pituitary gland. Then we have the pineal body, which is also responsible for receiving information about the state of like light and dark cycles, so basically our circadian rhythms from the environment. And it conveys this information to the pineal body, which then produces and secretes the hormone melatonin, which regulates our circadian rhythms. So right below the hypothalamus, there's usually the hypophyses, or the pituitary gland. And this is also known as the master gland because it releases the hormones that control so many different processes in the body. It has two parts, the anterior as well as the posterior. So your anterior produces and secretes 7 hormones that include FSH, LH, your adrenocorticotropic hormone, your thyroid stimulating hormone, prolactin, endorphins, and growth hormones, whereas your posterior pituitary gland stores and secretes ADH and oxytocin. And these hormones are not produced by the posterior pituitary gland, but they're in fact produced by the hypothalamus. I don't believe this brain has a pituitary gland here, because this is the hypothalamus, but I believe it's been cut off. Corpus callosum, and the corpus callosum is the thick bundle of nerve fibers that ensures both sides of the brain can communicate and send signals to each other. And then in this space right here, there's the septum pellucidum, which connects with the hippocampus and hypothalamus and kind of serves as a relay station between these structures. The septum pellucidum provides information to the rest of the body, generally about how the body is doing. So this space right here is your third ventricle, and the third ventricle is one of the 4 ventricles that are present in the brain, and it communicates with the other ones. So it contains your choroid plexus cells that are responsible for producing the cerebrospinal fluid that help protect the brain from injury, and it also transports nutrients and wastes for the brain. Under here is your 4th ventricle, and the 4th ventricle also contains choroid plexus cells that are responsible for producing CSF, and again they protect the brain from injury and transport nutrients and waste. It is connected to the 3rd ventricle by the cerebral aqueduct. So this is where the cerebral aqueduct is right here, and it's a very narrow kind of tubing and duct that allows the fluid to flow from the 4th ventricle here all the way to the 3rd one right here. So this is the pons, and it's responsible for the regulation and control for a number of vital functions. It acts as a control center, but it also contains nuclei of some important cranial nerves, and these nuclei relay signals from the forebrain to the cerebellum, and it also has nuclei that deal with primarily sleep, respiration, swallowing, bladder control. Then we have the medulla back here that is responsible for regulating some of the most basic functions of life. So for example, your autonomic nervous system, which includes respiration, cardiac function, vasodilation, reflexes like vomiting, coughing, sneezing, and swallowing that are essential to life and to survival are regulated. So this part is the midbrain, which is basically located in between your hypothalamus, which is here, and then your pons that start here. It's associated with hearing, vision, motor control, your sleep and wake cycle, so your circadian rhythms, as well as arousal, alertness, and temperature regulation. Colliculus here. And the superior colliculus is a structure that's part of the midbrain, and it is basically a circuit for the transformation of sensory input into movement output. Its major function is basically orientation, specifically with eye movements to objects of interest in the visual field. So I'm gonna try and find the choroid plexus cells here. That should be located on the roof of the 3rd ventricle. So this is the 3rd ventricle right here. It's the space in the brain. And I'm gonna just dissect a little bit here to see if I can find that structure. So now I'm going to dissect anterior in front of the thalamus and try to identify the white and gray matter. So here and here, we can see the white matter here. And then we can see the gray matter that's surrounding the white matter. The white matter is basically the myelinated axons, and the gray matter consists of the cell bodies. So this is the lateral ventricle in here, and in order to find the hippocampus, I'm gonna have to dissect everything dorsal to the floor of the lateral ventricle. So I believe this is the hippocampus because it was described as the inner folding of the cerebral cortex that's located right above the hypothalamus, and this was the hypothalamus. The thalamus. Hypothalamus was under here. The thalamus, and so I believe that this would be the hippocampus, and it functions in memory basically. So that's the end of my brain dissection video where I dissected and identified I believe 20 and a little bit over 20 structures. So thank you so much for watching.